The crack of the whip sounded like the sky splitting open, a sound that could break a heart before it ever touched skin. But she didn't flinch. Her body shook, sure, a tremor running through her like a cornered animal. But her chin was high, daring the pain to come, daring it to try and break what was already forged in fire. The crowd was a ring of silent judgment. Their shadows stretched long and hungry in the dying light. They were there to see a punishment. But more than that, they were there to see a spirit snap in two. And still, she stood. Her name was Nieli. She'd seen maybe 25 summers, but her eyes held the weight of 100 hard winters. The second lash hit, and the fire in those eyes just burned brighter. The men who did this, the tribal elders, they called it law. They said she broke tradition. They said she was a threat to the old ways. But her real crime? It was simpler than that, and a whole lot bigger. She'd chosen her own voice over their command, and for that, the law came for her with a leather strap. Her knees started to give, but her soul whispered, not yet. Not like this. And that's when she saw him, the one who swore he'd always stand by her. A young warrior with a smile that could charm the sun and a heart as hollow as a drum. He was in the crowd, watching, or pretending to watch. His eyes were turned away. He'd chosen his reputation over her. He'd chosen silence. Seeing him there, a cavern opened up in her gut. It wasn't love that hurt. It was betrayal. Betrayal from a hand you once held strikes deeper than any whip. It poisons the blood. The elders stood there, stiff and proud. Their eyes were like chips of flint. They thought this pain would bend her. They thought it would hammer her back into the shape they wanted. But something was shifting in the crowd. You could feel it. The women with their fists clenched white, the children who couldn't bear to look, the men who wondered if justice had already packed up and left town. The third lash fell. And this time, her voice broke free. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was something else. A note caught between a sob and a song. A sound so raw it flew across the sand like a bird with a broken wing. For a second, everything stopped. The wind, the breathing, the world held its breath to listen. And in that dead silence, another sound rolled in. Hoofbeats, coming in hard from over the ridge, a lone rider, dust kicking up behind him like a ghost. The setting sun lit the brim of his hat on fire. He wasn't one of them. You could tell by his clothes. Worn-out denim, leather boots scarred from 1,000 miles of hard riding, a gun holstered low on his hip, but his hand was nowhere near it. He rode that horse with a quiet kind of certainty, like he didn't belong to any tribe but the desert itself. His name was Caleb, not that anyone there knew it. He had the stillness of a man who'd learned a long time ago that the less you say, the more people hear. He got closer. The whispers started up, nervous and angry. Strangers weren't welcome here, especially not now. But he didn't slow down. He swung off his horse in one clean motion, landing soft. His calm was like a stone dropped into a quiet pond. It sent ripples of unease through the whole crowd. His eyes didn't scan the faces, didn't challenge the elders. He didn't even glance at the hollow-hearted warrior who'd let this happen. His eyes found Nieli, and they stayed right there. In his gaze, there was something that said, "Plain as day, I see you." The man with the whip raised it again. He hesitated, caught between the elder's order and the stranger's unnerving presence. Before the leather could fall, Caleb took one step forward. Just one. But it carried the weight of a final decision. The whip meant for Nieli cracked across Caleb's forearm instead. It tore through his shirt, splitting the skin underneath. He didn't even grunt. His other hand came down, landing firm but gentle on Nieli's shoulder. "You're safe now," he said. The words were barely a whisper, but in the dead quiet, they rang out louder than a gunshot. A word she hadn't heard in years. Safe. With her body bleeding and her spirit breaking, she looked at this stranger, and for the first time, tears welled in her eyes. Not tears of pain, not tears of surrender, but tears of pure, raw shock that a thing like kindness could still exist in a world this cruel. The crowd stirred. Some spat on the ground, others muttered curses under their breath. But nobody moved to stop him. There was a danger in his stillness, a promise of violence held perfectly in check. The elders' faces were tight with fury, their authority challenged right in front of everyone. The young warrior, her old love, couldn't even look. He just stared at his own feet, a monument to his own cowardice. Caleb's hands shook, but only from the pain in his arm as he worked the ropes binding her wrists. He untied her, and then he did something no one expected. He gathered her into his arms, her body feeling as light and fragile as a bird. He held her close, not like a prize, but like a man shielding a small flame from a hurricane. Her head rested against his chest. His heartbeat was slow and steady under her ear, like the rhythm of the earth itself. He started walking, straight through the crowd, and they parted for him like the sea. No one said a word. The only sound was the heavy breathing of 100 people who had just seen the law broken and a new one written. The sun was a sliver on the horizon, painting the whole desert in blood and fire. Behind them, whispers finally started, afraid, confused. They'd just watched a man walk into their sacred circle and defy their oldest laws without raising his voice. Ahead of them, the desert stretched out, open and endless. Nieli was half-conscious, floating in a sea of pain. But a question echoed in her mind. Why? Why would a stranger risk his life? Why did he look at her like she was more than just a broken woman at a whipping post? She clung to the memory of his voice. "You're safe now." As the desert swallowed them whole, she knew this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something new, and she had no idea if it was salvation or just a different kind of storm. The cabin was small, tucked away in a canyon where the wind couldn't bite so hard. It smelled of pine and wood smoke. Caleb laid her down on a simple bed, the blankets worn soft from 100 washings. The fire in the hearth threw dancing shadows on the walls. He didn't talk much. He just moved with a quiet purpose. He drew water from a bucket. He gently cleaned the bloody stripes on her back. His silence wasn't cold. It felt respectful, like words would be too clumsy, too rough for the moment. Nieli watched him through slitted eyes. She was still a wounded animal, ready to bite the hand that fed her. But there was a calmness about this man that settled her nerves. His hands were rough, calloused from work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask what she'd done to deserve the whip. He just tended to her wounds, and every time she winced, his brow would furrow with a shared pain. This level of care was alien to her. It felt like trying to drink water after a lifetime of swallowing sand. She couldn't understand it. What kind of man takes on another person's pain without asking for anything in return? Days bled into one another. The world was marked by the cry of a hawk in the morning and the long shadows of dusk. Caleb cooked simple meals, beans and salt pork, bread baked in a skillet over the fire. He always served her first. He'd wait for her to start eating before he'd touch his own food. In the evenings, he'd sit by the fire and pull out an old dented harmonica. He'd play these low, lonely tunes that seemed to drift through the cabin like ghosts. Sometimes Nieli would close her eyes and just listen. Other times, she'd hum along, a half-forgotten melody from her childhood. It was a language without words, a conversation held in music and silence. They were building something, a fragile bridge between two strangers who'd met in violence and blood. One afternoon, an old woman from a homestead a few miles away showed up. Her hair was in 2 long gray braids, and she carried a basket of herbs. She introduced herself as Alara. She cleaned Neely's wounds with practiced, knowing hands. As she worked, she leaned in and whispered, "He carries a lot of grief, that one. His silence isn't emptiness. It's a wall he built to hold it all in. The words stuck with Neely. She looked at Caleb, who was outside chopping wood, the steady thump of the axe a constant rhythm to their days. She realized Alara was right. His quiet wasn't a lack of feeling. It was a container for it. But what grief, what sorrow had carved those lines around his eyes? The mystery of him was as vast as the desert outside. As her body healed, so did something deeper inside her. She started walking around the cabin. Then she took a few steps outside, feeling the sun on her skin. It was the same sun that had beaten down on her at the whipping post, but it felt different now, warmer, kinder. Caleb was always nearby, mending a fence, cleaning his saddle. He never crowded her, he just existed. A steady, reassuring presence. The way he looked at her unsettled her more than the whip had. He didn't see a victim. He didn't see a broken thing that needed fixing. He just saw her. That quiet acceptance was a kind of power she'd never known. It didn't demand anything. It just offered. One night the moon was full and bright, turning the canyon walls to silver. Caleb was by the fire, the harmonica quiet in his lap. Nieli was braiding a piece of dried grass just to keep her hands busy. The silence between them felt different tonight, heavier, full of unspoken things. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, but it had the weight of a mountain. "I didn't know your name that day," he said, not looking at her. "But I knew your story." Neely's hands froze. The grass braid fell from her fingers. "What do you mean?" He finally turned to look at her, and the firelight caught the sadness in his eyes. "The elder who ordered your punishment. His name is Kale, the warrior who turned his back on you. That's his son, isn't it? Tarek." A cold dread washed over her. "How do you know their names?" "Because Kale did the same thing to my family 20 years ago," Caleb said, and his voice was flat, empty of all emotion. "He accused my father of breaking tradition, a tradition he made up on the spot. He had him punished, drove him from the tribe. My father died in the desert a week later. My mother, she didn't last the winter." The air in the cabin was suddenly thick, hard to breathe. The story she thought she was in, a story of random cruelty and unexpected rescue, it had just been torn down. This was something else entirely. This wasn't random. "You came back for him," she whispered. It wasn't a question. "I came back for justice," he corrected her. "I've been watching him for months, learning his routines, learning who he trusts. I was waiting for the right moment to expose him for the tyrant he is. But then, I saw what he was doing to you, using the same laws, the same lies. I couldn't wait any longer." Everything clicked into place. His arrival wasn't a coincidence. His intervention wasn't just kindness. It was a declaration of war. He hadn't just saved her. He had chosen her. He had seen a fellow victim of the same monster, and he'd stepped out of the shadows. "The old woman," Neely said, her mind racing. "Alara." "Her husband was another one of Kale's victims," Caleb confirmed. "There are others. People who've been hurt by him, silenced by him. People who are just waiting for someone to stand up. He had been building an army. A quiet, patient army of the wronged. And by saving her, he had just fired the first shot." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just a quiet savior, but a man burning with a cold, righteous fury that had been simmering for 2 decades. He had saved her life, yes. But he had also just dragged her into his war, and she realized, with a terrifying clarity, that the whipping post might have been the safest place she'd been all day. The weight of his confession settled between them, heavier than a burial stone. She wasn't a survivor he'd stumbled upon. She was a pawn, a piece in his long, simmering game of revenge. The thought was a bitter pill. Had his kindness been a lie? A tool to get her on his side? "So what now?" she asked, her voice hard. "You use me to get back at him?" Caleb shook his head slowly. The look in his eyes wasn't cunning. It was tired. "No," he said. "When I saw you standing there, taking that whip without screaming, I saw the same fire that was in my father before Cale broke him. I stepped in for you, not for my plan, for you. But now Cale knows I'm here. He won't rest until he finds me. And since you're with me, you're a target too. My war is your war now, whether you chose it or not." He was right. By carrying her away, he had painted a target on both their backs. There was no going back to her old life. There was no fading into the desert. There was only forward, into the heart of his storm. A strange feeling washed over her. The anger at being used faded, replaced by something else, a flicker of shared purpose. Cale had tried to break her spirit. He had succeeded in breaking Caleb's family. They were both scarred by the same man. "He took everything from you," she said softly. "He took my past," Caleb answered, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I won't let him take my future." The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not awkward, not heavy. It was the quiet of two soldiers before a battle, a shared understanding that needed no words. For the next few days, the cabin became a war room. Alara would visit, seeming to bring herbs, but really bringing information. Whispers from the tribe. Who was loyal to Cale? Who was starting to doubt him? Who was afraid? Caleb would listen, his face a stone mask, piecing together the political map of the tribe he'd been exiled from. He wasn't just planning revenge, he was planning a coup. He showed Nieli how to use a knife, not just for cutting vegetables, but for defending herself. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs in the sand, how to move through the canyon without making a sound. He was giving her the tools to survive the world he'd pulled her into. And as he taught her, she saw a different side of him. The grief was still there, a deep well of it. But there was also a brilliant strategist, a patient teacher, a man driven by a profound sense of justice. She started to trust him, not just his strength, but his heart. She saw that his kindness wasn't a lie. It was the fuel for his rage. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he laid a piece of paper on the table. It was a map, crudely drawn, of the tribal lands. "Cale's power comes from controlling the water," Caleb explained, pointing to a single spring on the map. "He tells everyone the spirits bless that spring for him alone, that only he can ask them for water. But it's a lie. My father knew it. That spring belonged to all the people. Kyle took it by force, then invented a tradition to justify it. This was the root of it all, not just cruelty, greed. He's been selling water rights to the railroad men," Caleb continued, his voice low and angry. "Secretly, bleeding the tribe dry while telling them he's protecting their sacred traditions. That's his real crime. The rest, the punishments, the fear, it's all just to keep people from looking too closely." Neely remembered whispers, talk of cattle dying of thirst, of crops failing. Everyone blamed a bad season or angry spirits. No one ever suspected their leader was poisoning them from the inside. "How do you prove it?" she asked. Caleb pointed to a spot on the map, a few miles from the main camp. "There's a cave here. It's where the railroad surveyors meet him. They keep records, ledgers, proof of their deals. If we can get those ledgers and show them to the people, they'll see the truth," Neely finished for him. A plan began to form. A dangerous, desperate plan. But before they could act, a new complication arrived. A lone rider approached the cabin. It wasn't one of Alara's contacts. As the figure grew closer, a knot of ice formed in Nieli's stomach. It was Tarek, the warrior who had watched her bleed. He dismounted, his hands held up to show he was unarmed. He looked ragged, afraid. "Nieli," he called out. "I need to talk to you." Caleb stepped out of the cabin, positioning himself between them. His hand rested on the butt of his gun. He said nothing. I made a mistake, Tarek said, his eyes pleading with Neely. A terrible mistake. My father. He's become a monster. I see that now. I want to help you. I can tell you his plans. I can help you stop him. Neely stared at the man she once thought she loved. His handsome face was twisted with what looked like remorse, but she remembered his eyes at the whipping post. Turned away. Blank. He wasn't here because he'd seen the light. He was here because he was a coward. He had seen Caleb's defiance, heard the whispers of rebellion, and he was trying to switch to the winning side. You had your chance to help me, Nieli said, her voice as cold as a winter night. You stood there and watched. He would have punished me too, Tarek pleaded. And that's why you'll never be a leader, Caleb said, his voice cutting through the air. You're afraid of the man you should be fighting. Get off this land, and if I see you again, I won't be so patient. Tarek's face crumbled. He saw there was no easy way out for him. He got on his horse and rode away, a man running from his own shadow. Watching him go, Neely felt no satisfaction, only a cold pity. But his visit changed things. It meant Cale was getting nervous. He knew something was coming. They were running out of time. That night, the air in the cabin was electric with tension. The final pieces of the plan were in place. They would move under the cover of the new moon, infiltrate the cave, get the ledgers, and then, at the next tribal council, expose Cale for the traitor he was. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail, 1,000 ways to die. Caleb looked at her, his face serious in the firelight. You don't have to do this, he said. I can take you far from here. You could start a new life. She thought about it. A life without fear, without fighting. A life of peace. It was tempting. But then she thought of the stripes on her back. She thought of Caleb's dead father. She thought of all the other people living in fear under Cale's thumb. Running wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage. No, she said, her voice steady. He tried to silence my voice. Now I'm going to make sure everyone hears it. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. It was the first time she'd ever seen him truly smile. It transformed him. All right, he said. But if we're going to do this, if we're going to stand against him together, there's something we should do first. He reached into a small wooden box on the mantel. When he turned back, he was holding a simple silver ring. It wasn't fancy. It looked old, handmade. This was my mother's, he said softly. Tradition says a man and woman who face a great battle together should be bound as one, so their spirits can find each other in the next life, if they fall. He wasn't proposing a marriage of love and quiet days. He was proposing an alliance of warriors, a bond forged in shared purpose and mutual respect, a promise to stand together in this life and whatever came after. He held out the ring. He didn't ask her to be his wife. He asked her to be his partner, his equal. She looked at the ring, then into his eyes. And in that moment, she saw her future. Not a life of safety, but a life of meaning. She had been punished for choosing her own voice. Now she was going to use that same voice to choose her own destiny. She held out her hand. Yes, she whispered. The word was a promise, a vow. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was cool against her skin, a perfect fit. It wasn't a chain. It was armor. They were no longer two broken people, haunted by the same man. They were a single unit, a reckoning. And they were about to bring the storm right to Cale's door. The new moon was a sliver of black glass in the sky. The desert was so dark it felt like you could drown in it. Caleb and Nieli moved like shadows, their footsteps making no sound on the sand and rock. The air was cold, tense. Every gust of wind sounded like a sentry's warning. They reached the cliffs near the meeting cave. Below, two of Kyle's warriors stood guard, their figures barely visible by the light of a small, sputtering fire. They looked bored, complacent. They didn't expect anyone to be foolish enough to challenge their chief. "I'll take the one on the right," Caleb whispered, his voice a low rumble. "You create a diversion on the left." Neely nodded. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. The point of no return. She circled around, silent as a mountain cat. She found a loose pile of rocks on a ledge above the second guard. Taking a deep breath, she pushed one with her foot. It wasn't a loud noise, just a skittering of pebbles down the cliff face. But in the dead quiet of the night, it sounded like an avalanche. The guard on the left spun around, peering into the darkness, his hand gripping his rifle. "Who's there?" he called out. It was all the distraction Caleb needed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion. Before the first guard could even turn his head, Caleb was on him. There was a muffled thud, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The second guard heard the sound and turned back, raising his rifle. But Neely was already moving. She dropped from her ledge, landing behind him, and brought the heavy hilt of her knife down hard on the back of his head. He went down without a sound. They dragged the two men into the bushes and tied them up. Adrenaline sang in Neely's veins. She had never felt so afraid or so alive. The cave was just ahead. The entrance was a dark, jagged mouth in the rock. Caleb lit a small lantern, turning the wick down so it cast only a faint, flickering glow. They slipped inside. The air was damp and smelled of cold stone. After a few yards, the narrow passage opened into a larger chamber, and there it was, a rough wooden table, a few chairs, and a heavy iron-bound chest. "The ledgers," Caleb breathed. He knelt beside the chest. The lock was thick, heavy-duty. He pulled a set of thin metal tools from his pocket. For long, agonizing minutes, the only sound was the faint metallic click of the lockpicks. Neely stood watch at the entrance, her knife in her hand, her ears straining to hear any sound over the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, with a loud clank, the lock gave way. Caleb lifted the heavy lid. Inside were several large, leather-bound books. He opened one. The pages were filled with neat columns of numbers, dates, and names. The names of railroad men, the amounts of money paid, the locations of land and water rights secretly sold off. It was all there. The proof that would destroy Cale. "We have it," Caleb whispered, a note of triumph in his voice. "We have it all." But as he reached to pull the ledgers from the chest, his lantern light caught something else. Lying at the bottom of the chest, beneath the books, was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Curious, Caleb set the ledger aside and picked it up. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was not another book, but a child's toy, a small, carved wooden horse, its paint faded and chipped. Tied around its neck with a piece of worn leather was a single, silver bead, identical to the ones worn by women of Neely's tribe. Neely stared at it, a cold, sick feeling creeping into her stomach. "I've seen that before," she said, her voice trembling. "A girl from my village. She had a horse just like that. She vanished last spring. Cale said she ran away." Caleb turned the horse over in his hand. His face had gone pale. On the underside, 2 initials were crudely carved into the wood. CS. "Caleb, what is it?" Neely asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up at her, and the grief in his eyes was so profound, so raw, it was like looking into an open wound. "My sister," he said, his voice cracking. "Her name was Clara Sand. She was taken by raiders when she was 6 years old, a year after my father was exiled. I thought she was dead." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't just about revenge for his father anymore. It wasn't just about stolen land and water. Cale hadn't just exiled his family, he had stolen his sister. He had taken a 6-year-old girl and sold her. The toy horse was a trophy, a sick memento of his crime, but the twist was even deeper. The girl from Neely's village, the one who had run away. Was it possible? The girl who disappeared, Neely said, her mind racing to connect the impossible. Her name was Alina, but she was an orphan, raised by the tribe. No one knew where she came from. She had this horse. She said it was the only thing she had from her parents. Caleb was on his feet, his face a mask of terrible understanding. He didn't kill her, he breathed. He brought her here. He raised her as one of his own, an orphan in the very tribe he destroyed her family in. And then, when she got older, what did he do with her? The girl who vanished last spring, the railroad men, the secret deals. It all came together in one horrifying picture. Kyle hadn't just sold the tribe's water, he was selling its people, his own adopted daughter, Caleb's sister. The righteous anger that had been driving Caleb was instantly replaced by a white-hot personal fury. This was a monster beyond his darkest imaginings. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the mouth of the cave. "It seems you found my little treasure chest." They spun around. Cale stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, and behind him were at least 10 of his warriors, their rifles aimed directly at the cave entrance. And standing next to Cale, his face a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction, was Tarek. He had sold them out. "Did you really think you could challenge me?" Kyle sneered, stepping into the light. His eyes fell on the wooden horse in Caleb's hand. "Ah, so you know. I wondered if you'd ever figure it out." She was a beautiful girl. The railroad foreman paid a very handsome price for her. A guttural roar of pure rage erupted from Caleb's chest. He launched himself toward the cave entrance, but the warriors raised their rifles. "I wouldn't," Kyle said calmly. "It's over. You came for justice, but all you've found is a grave." He smiled, a cruel, vicious thing. "A family reunion of sorts. You'll join your father and sister soon enough." They were trapped. The ledgers were useless if they were dead. The truth would die with them, here in this cold, dark cave. Cale had won. All their planning, all their courage, had led them right into his hand. It was a perfect trap. But he'd made one mistake. He'd underestimated Neely. While all eyes were on Caleb, she had been backing away, deeper into the shadows at the rear of the cave. She remembered the map. There was another marking on it, a small notation Caleb had made. "Possible rear passage. Unexplored." Her fingers scrambled against the cold rock wall, searching, praying, and then she felt it. A draft of air. A crack in the stone, hidden behind a curtain of rock. It was small, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She looked at Caleb, who was locked in a standoff with Cale, his body vibrating with a rage too big to contain. She had to get his attention. She picked up a small stone and threw it against the far wall of the chamber. The sound was enough. Cale's men flinched, their rifles shifting for a second. In that instant, Caleb's eyes met hers. She jerked her head toward the back of the cave. He saw the crack in the wall. He understood. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in his eyes. "You talk a lot for a man who's about to lose everything," Caleb said to Cale, his voice dangerously low. He was buying them time. Cale laughed. "Brave words. Let's see how brave you are when—" He was cut off by an explosion of action. Caleb kicked over the heavy table, sending it crashing toward the warriors. He threw the lantern at the same time. It shattered against the rock, and flaming oil sprayed across the cave floor, creating a wall of fire between them and Cale's men. "Go!" Caleb yelled at Neely. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled through the narrow crack in the rock, the stone scraping her skin. It was pitch black on the other side. She could hear Caleb right behind her, pushing the ledgers through the gap before pulling himself in. Behind them, there were shouts of anger and confusion as Cale's men tried to get around the fire. They were in a tight, natural tunnel, crawling on their hands and knees in total darkness. They could hear the warriors smashing their way into the passage behind them. They were running out of time. They scrambled forward, the air getting colder, fresher. And then they saw it. A faint patch of gray light ahead. an exit. They burst out of the tunnel and onto a high, narrow ledge on the other side of the cliff. The moon was bright now. They could see the entire desert floor spread out below them. But there was no easy way down. It was a sheer drop of 100 feet. They could hear Kyle's men in the tunnel right behind them. In a few seconds, they would be on them. They were cornered again, trapped between the killers and a fatal fall. Caleb looked at Neely, the grim reality setting in. He held the ledgers tight to his chest. "I can hold them off," he said. "You have to get these books to Alara. Tell the people the truth." "No," Neely said, grabbing his arm. "We do this together. Or not at all." She looked down the sheer cliff face. Her eyes scanned the rock, searching for any possibility, any hope. And then she saw it. About 20 feet down, a thick, gnarled root from an ancient juniper tree snaked out from a crack in the rock. It was their only chance. A suicidal, 1 in a million chance. "There," she said, pointing. Caleb saw it. He didn't hesitate. He slung the bag of ledgers over his shoulder. "I'll go first," he said. "If I make it, you follow." He swung himself over the edge. For a terrifying second, he dangled over the abyss. Then his boots found a small foothold. He began to climb down, his fingers finding tiny cracks in the rock. Behind them, the first of Kale's warriors squeezed out of the tunnel and onto the ledge. He raised his rifle. Nieli acted on pure instinct. She grabbed a loose rock from the ledge and threw it with all her might. It struck the warrior in the head, and he staggered back with a cry, giving Caleb the precious seconds he needed. He reached the root, wrapping his legs around it, securing his hold. "Now!" he yelled up at her. Nieli swung over the edge just as 2 more warriors appeared. A gunshot rang out, and a chip of rock exploded next to her head. She ignored it, her focus absolute. She scrambled down the rock face, her fingers raw, her muscles screaming. She felt Caleb's hand grab her ankle, guiding her foot to a hold. She reached the root, gasping for breath, her body pressed against his. Above them, Cale appeared on the ledge, his face contorted with rage. "You can't escape!" he screamed. He aimed his pistol down at them, but from this angle, with the curve of the cliff, he didn't have a clear shot. His men were trying to climb down after them, but the rock face was too steep, too exposed. Caleb looked at Neely. "Ready for one more jump?" he asked, a wild look in his eyes. Below the root, there was another drop of about 15 feet to a steep, sandy slope. It was too far to climb, but maybe not too far to fall. Before she could answer, he wrapped one arm around her waist, held the ledgers tight with the other, and pushed off from the cliff. They fell. The world was a blur of rock and sky and wind screaming in her ears. They hit the sandy slope hard, tumbling end over end, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. They rolled, gaining speed, sand and rock flying around them until they finally crashed into a thicket of mesquite bushes at the bottom of the canyon. For a moment, there was only silence, the ringing in their ears, and the pain. Nieli pushed herself up, bruised and battered, but alive. Caleb was next to her, groaning, but also in one piece. The bag with the ledgers was still slung over his shoulder. They had done it. They had escaped. They didn't wait. They got to their feet and ran, disappearing into the labyrinth of canyons as the moon lit their way. They knew Cale would send trackers after them at first light, but they had the truth in their hands. And now, the hunt was over. The war was about to begin. They reached Alara's homestead just before dawn, exhausted, bleeding, but triumphant. The old woman took one look at them, and at the bag in Caleb's hand, and her weathered face broke into a grim smile. "It's time," she said. Word spread like wildfire. Alara sent riders to the other homesteads, to the families who had also suffered under Cale's rule. They were to gather at the tribal council circle at midday. They were told to bring their courage. By the time the sun was high in the sky, a crowd had formed. It was different from the one at the whipping post. There was fear here, yes, but there was also anger. A simmering resentment that was finally ready to boil over. Caleb and Neely walked into the center of the circle. Caleb carried the ledgers. Neely, her head held high, walked beside him. Her presence sent a shockwave through the crowd. The woman they had seen broken and bleeding was back, and she was not broken anymore. Then Kyle arrived with his warriors, Tarek trailing behind him like a beaten dog. Kyle's face was a thundercloud of fury. He had expected them to be dead or halfway to the territories. Not here, in the heart of his power, challenging him. "This is illegal!" Kyle bellowed. "This council was not summoned by me. Seize them!" His warriors moved forward. But then, something happened. Other men from the crowd stepped forward to block them. Men whose families had gone hungry. Men whose wells had run dry. They didn't have rifles, but they had conviction. The warriors hesitated. "You have no authority here, Cale," Caleb said, his voice ringing out across the circle. "Your authority is built on lies, and today, the lies end." He opened the first ledger. "For 20 years this man has told you he protects our traditions," Caleb shouted, "but he has been selling our land, our water, our future, to the very outsiders he tells you to fear." He read the entries, the dates, the sums of money. A low murmur went through the crowd as the betrayal sank in. "He told you I was a criminal," Caleb continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He exiled my father and left him to die in the desert, but he didn't tell you why. My father knew about these deals. He was going to expose him, so Cale silenced him." The murmur grew louder. People were looking at Cale, not with fear, but with dawning horror. "And he told you that Neely defied tradition." Caleb's voice rose to a roar. "He punished her for refusing to marry his spineless son. But the real reason is that she, too, was getting too close to the truth. He punishes anyone who asks questions. He rules not by law, but by fear." Then he looked directly at Cale, his eyes burning with a hatred that was 20 years in the making. "But his greatest crime was not against his people. It was against my family. He stole my sister, Clara, a 6-year-old girl, and he sold her to the railroad men." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was a crime beyond comprehension, a violation of every law, both of man and of the spirits. Cale's face went white. "Lies. These are all lies from an outsider." "Is it a lie?" Caleb asked, and he held up the small carved wooden horse. "Do you recognize this, Cale? A trophy from the little girl you sold?" All eyes turned to Cale. He had no answer. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth was a floodlight, and he was trapped in its beam. The crowd that had once feared him now saw him for what he was, a thief, a liar, a monster. They started to close in. The circle grew tighter. His warriors, seeing the tide turn, lowered their weapons and backed away, unwilling to die for a disgraced chief. Kyle was alone. Tarek, his son, took one look at the murderous rage on the faces around him, and he fled, running from the circle, from the tribe, from his own shame. Kyle pulled a knife. His eyes were wild with panic. But he was surrounded. There was nowhere to go. Caleb stepped forward. "This is not for the mob," he said, his voice calm again. "This is for the law, the real law." He turned to the crowd. "He will be judged, not by my anger, but by the people he betrayed." The tribe took Kyle into custody, his reign of terror over in a single shattering moment. Justice had come, not quickly, not easily, but it had come. In the days that followed, a new council was formed. The stolen lands were reclaimed. The deals Cale had made were broken. A new chief was chosen, a wise old man who had been one of Ilara's allies. Caleb and Neely stood on the ridge overlooking the village, watching the smoke rise from the cook fires. It felt like the world had been reborn. "What will you do now?" Neely asked him. "My war is over," Caleb said. He looked at her, and the grief in his eyes was still there, but it was balanced by something else now. Peace. "My sister is gone," I can't change that, but I can honor her. I can help these people rebuild. He took her hand. The silver ring on her finger glinted in the sun. What will we do now? He corrected himself. Nieli looked at the scars on his arm and thought of the scars on her own back. They were marks of survival, proof that they could endure the fire and come out stronger. This man had walked into her life and not just saved her, but had shown her how to save herself. She smiled. I think we build a life so good, it makes the ghosts of our past jealous. He squeezed her hand. For the first time, the future didn't look like a storm on the horizon. It looked like an open road, a journey they would walk together. They had faced down a tyrant and freed a nation. They had found justice in the desert, and in each other, they had found a home. A story like that reminds you that even in the darkest of times, one or two good people can make all the difference. That courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice, revenge, and redemption, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing.